see, but not any of the students. So it's nice to be back here. And thanks to Doug and Roland for inviting me. So I kind of came full circle because I realized in my exit seminar 7 years ago, one of the last chapters of my dissertation, I talked about 3D moment tensor inversions, and one of the conclusions and path forward that I had in there was talking about it would be nice if we can do inversions with adjoint full waveform tomography models. And here I am 7 years later, we finally have some results from using a new model that we developed, led by Artie, who was here on a project that's been going on that just ended in September. So applying the adjoint waveform full tomography model to regional moment tensor inversions, and the main motivation behind that project is to see what does it do? Does it help us improve monitoring, characterizing seismic sources? And that's kind of one of the main themes of the laboratory that we're interested in. But before I kind of jumped in and talk about the project, let me see if I can advance my slides. I just want to kind of give a brief introduction to the laboratory. I know I met some of the students and postdocs today, and they were asking questions about it. So I figure it would be good to have these 2 slides in just to talk about what Lawrence Livermore is. So the lab was established in the 1952 at the height of the Cold War. So it's one of the weapons laboratory, but it's also one of the 17 DOE national laboratories. It's a multi-program national security laboratory, primarily funded by Department of Energy. And I think since I've joined the lab, we've grown from like 6,000 employees to 8,000. And I know they hired a ton of people over COVID. But of that, there's postdoc and graduate scholar programs and summer student internship. And actually, how I got started at the laboratory is because with the project that Doug had, I started working with folks at Livermore, and I did a summer internship and then did the postdoc, and now got converted at the laboratory. And we actually have a couple of people there from Berkeley. I think I counted, we currently have 5 people who are former Berkeley students. So there's definitely a presence there.
Just in seismology or across the
Just in seismology, yeah. Yeah. So I counted there's Mike Paciano, who was former student. And then, a long time ago, I was just on a trip with Mike, and I told him that I was coming to BSL, and he was like, "Oh, it's always good to come back to BSL and give a seminar." And then there was Denise Templeton, worked with Roland, Sean Ford, and me, worked with Doug, and now Chiang is there. So we have 5 people. And I know Rob Ford actually is at Sandia now, who was Richard's student from many years ago. So I do see quite a bit of Berkeley folks. It's kind of nice to see familiar faces. But anyway, back to the topic here. Yeah, so like I said, our group is specifically seismology, but there's programs on biosecurity, counterterrorism, and all that stuff. So and one of the key facilities that we have at the laboratory is the HPC computing system, which we greatly benefited from this particular project. So just like a little bit about the program that I'm under at. It's a little bit complicated, but we have like the several groups of different like seismologists, computer scientists, and programists under the same program. So that's the geophysical monitoring program. So that's including seismologists like me and Artie. But then we also have quite a few people from what we call I call it the computation group, but basically those are all the software developers. The nice thing is that we sit really close, really right next door with all the developers, so we can work closely with them to develop new tools and also database management folks. So there's expertise in seismic database management. We host one of the IRIS data mirrors, and of course, high performance computing. And in terms of the seismological research, I will talk about source and the Earth models, but there's also people doing earthquake location, geothermal, induced seismicity, carbon storage, a variety of stuff. So kind of going back to the project that I'm going to talk about today. So this is the team that was on the project. So on the top here are the Livermore folks. RDU was the PI. I worked on mainly the source inversion part. First, Morency was focusing on the, we have one of the tasks was looking at a local scale geothermal environment. So using spectral element methods to look at velocity changes across space and time. And then we partnered up with the folks from Mosaic. They're all former students at ETH or postdocs at ETH, and we use Solvis, which is a spectral element method to do the full waveform simulations. And of course, you guys know Claire. Claire joined our team and worked on a model specifically for the Canvas model for California and Nevada area. So one of the key motivations behind, for my part of the project, is really to look at how we can utilize these full waveform tomography. Like I said, when I was graduating, we start to see there's some global models. There are not as many on regional scale, and I remember back then we were using either service wave models or travel time velocity model. So one of the interests is to use full waveform tomography models and see if they can improve our estimates of the source. And the reason is that using these regional long distance period waveforms to determine momentum is a pretty routine and reliable approach. So we can use this to describe a variety of sources. One of the attractiveness of this method is because we can use that to characterize not just earthquakes, but also explosions and also mine collapses. Like the figure, let me see if I can turn on the laser pointer here.
Yeah.
Oh, let me go back. For some reason, my forward and backwards key are not working. So let me just go back one more slide. So, and you can see these are all, anywhere from a regional scale, there's like a magnitude 6 event down to a magnitude 2.3. So it's kind of applicable in a wide range of sources and also distances and sizes. But one of the issue with going down to smaller events or farther away, or stations recorded farther away, is that we need a well-calibrated Earth model to compute the Green's function. Since we're fitting the full waveform, we need to know the path. And the smaller events recorded at these longer distances have weaker signals, especially at long periods above the background noise. So that kind of leaves us with only, mostly higher frequency waves are impacted by the 3D structure more. And also just because the signal might not be as visible. So if you look at one of the 2008 Wells magnitude 4 aftershock, at 10 to 20 seconds, you see really good signal. At the typical band that we looked at 20 to 50 seconds, the signal is only slightly above the noise. And kind of going back to this mining example that I showed, one of these stations that are only like about 100 kilometers away, you can see the waveforms look quite complicated, and just by looking at that, you can't really fit it with the 1D model. So it's both of a frequency problem and then also the distance. So now without the noise part, not letting me advance this slide. Okay, here. So one of the first thing of the project is to develop a full waveform model based on adjoint waveform tomography for improved seismic source simulation in general. And the key thing is that there's a lot of advances in computational seismology and also HPC that makes it easier to compute the 3D Earth models. So there's a lot of advancements out there to make these computations faster and easier. But the limit for us is actually having these models. So it's still, can still be quite expensive to get good models using adjoint waveform tomography. So I'll just quickly give a slide on the Western US 256 model. So this was published this year at GRL. So this is the Western US adjoint waveform photography model that I'll be using to look at the source inversions, how that compared to sort of the routine traditional 1D methods that we use. So WS256 is a radial anisotropic model of the crust and upper mantle. And we're focusing on the Western US because this is a place we have a lot of data. So one of the first thing is to characterize an area that has a lot of data, and we can test the source inversions before we kind of go into an unknown region of interest. And another key reason of using Western US is also because in addition to earthquake data, we also have historic nuclear tests and also mine collapses. So we can look at different sources as well. So this particular inversion for this particular model is based on a relatively conservative multi-scale approach. So the inversion started with at the longer periods, I think it's 50 to 20 seconds, and then gradually moving down to 20 seconds. And the final model has 256 iterations. You can see the left side here is the path coverage. And then the right side is the average shear wave speeds at 60 kilometers depth. So we have a total of 94,000 waveforms from 72 bits. And then at the end of this, the final inversion uses minimum period wave down to 20 seconds. So it's a 20 to 120 second model. In addition, Claire also was working on a sort of a more local model, just focusing on the California and Nevada region. This is a comparison of using different starting models. So I didn't mention before, but for WS256, we start with starting model. It's a 3D model developed at Livermore called Spiral. And here, on this particular project is looking at different starting models and how that impacts the final inversion. And one of the key kind of takeaways for this particular project is that the inversion converges to a similar Earth model with comparable waveform fits. And I know Claire is also looking at 3D moment tensor inversions using this particular model and trying to go down to push to shorter periods. Because the Western US is a little bit larger, much larger region. So we've gone down to 20 seconds. The latest model goes down to 16 seconds. And it's definitely, there is a bit of a steeper jump going from 20 to 16 seconds in terms of computational resources. So here I'm focusing on the 20 to 50 second period. So just before I jump into the look at the results, I kind of want to just go over like how we actually do the inversion. So for the 3D moment tensor inversion, mathematically you can directly inverting the source using the single source component. But we do follow the formulation by Kikuchi and Kanamori, so that parameterize the moment tensor as 6 elementary moment tensors. So it's kind of like similar to what the BSL does with the Herman and Langston and Herman approach, but the way that we formulate the moment tensor elements is a little bit different. So we can take advantage of, so we can use 3D inversions. And the advantage of this approach is that each of the subgroups of the system have a specific solution that has a kind of direct physical meaning. And also it allows you to do deviatoric and isotropic components. Instead of just directly inverting for the 6 single force components, you always have to do the complete moment tensor. So here is just an equation of the moment tensor and weighted by their elementary Green's functions. And these are the 6 elementary moment tensors that are used for the inversion. So the basic workflow for the 3D moment tensor inversion, somewhat similar to the 1D case. Of course, we process data, and because we're using absolute amplitudes, we have to include instrument correction, filtering, all that stuff. So because the data set we're looking at actually includes quite a bit of data, we kind of employ this station selection criteria based on signal to noise ratio and then distant azimuth. So basically for each of these quadrants here, I'm selecting the station with the highest signal SNR and include that in inversion. So even then when I go through this criteria, you still come down to like, anywhere from 30 to 60 stations, which we typically don't have that luxury, but because Western US, there's a lot of good coverage here. And for the inversion, we apply sort of this grid search approach to find the optimal time shifts. And I'll kind of go back to what these time shifts mean. But basically, the initial search, we apply the same time shift for all the stations. This is kind of the most time-consuming part of the inversion. And then we kind of iteratively go back to each station to find a best shift that gives us the best waveform fit or highest variance that should work for each station. And here is just kind of an example of what that looks like in terms of the time shift values. And then the time shifts, you have to kind of cap them at a certain value. So we typically don't allow them to be more than half of the minimum filter wavelength. Even that is, that's a pretty wide range because you don't want to get into cycle skipping and anything like that. And if you have larger time shift, that's kind of indicative that your model is probably not suitable for what you want to invert for. So one of the issues that we run into with the full waveform, with the 3D moment inversion is trying to manage all the data and the synthetics. So what we do is actually the data synthetics are all stored in this ASDF format, HDF5 based format. And so all the data and Green's functions are kind of processed, and we use the Python library OpsPy to do all the processing. So we have different HDF5 files for the data and also for the Green's functions. And then a separate run for the 1D because we're trying to compare what is the improvement from 1D to 3D. And then for the 1D model, in this case, we're using the Western US model by Herman et al. in 2011, since that model kind of covers most of the region that we're interested. As you can see, is we start to run into issues offshore, and that's when really the advantage of using a single 3D model to cover a large zone. And I'll show that in the results. So I guess I forgot to say, if you have any questions, just stop me anytime.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
You said you use 1D, the WUS model, but your 3D model has a 1D panel. So how does that relate?
But the 3D model is, the Green's functions is computed. So we use solvers to simulate the 3D Green's functions. Because I'm not quite understand the question, the 1D average.
So why do you use the 1D model? It's model when
Oh, so what we do is we compute moment tensors for two separate models. Yeah, so there are two different models results. Then we look at the comparison, what the outputs are.
We have the 1D model from the average 3D is better than this 1D model.
Can you repeat the question?
I mean, you will have two 1D model. One,
We use one 1D model.
yeah, so
Yeah, we didn't test different 1D models. For example, like we didn't use GIL 7 for just the Bay Area or things like that.
okay.
You can definitely, as I was going through the data set, you can definitely tell, like when you're going to, Mendocino or looking at places north of California, you can definitely improve it with a different 1D model. So you can, that's what, we did in the past is to pass into the 1D model. But what we found with the 3D models, you can just use the one 3D model to cover the entire region. Yeah, especially offshore, makes a big difference. So for the 3D Green's functions, like I said, it's similar to the adjoint waveform topography. We use solvers to calculate them. Because in order to calculate, you need some kind of wave propagation solver, either finite difference or spectral element methods, or any of the ones that's available out there. We've done it in SW4 in the past for a smaller region. But since here we're going out to farther distances, we're using solvers here. And one of the neat things of this particular program is that it has a relatively easy Python interface that we can work with. So for each of the events, we set up a project and calculate the Green's functions for multiple source depth, because we also search for the optimal source depth. And because you're using everything in kind of combining these Python notebook, it's really good for reproducibility. So for example, if somebody else wants to compute and see if the results matches mine, I can just pass the notebook directly to somebody else and they can know all the steps I've done. So that's kind of a good thing out of using this kind of Python notebook approach that we've done. And on the right, the figure on the right-hand side just shows an example showing the status, when we submit these runs. So is this for 60 simulation on Lassen on one of our GPU computing system, and it's pretty quick. I think for this one, probably a few minutes, maybe like 5 to 10 minutes, and it's done. So using the GPU system really helped a lot, especially. I'm not going to show today, but we've tried to look at 15-second data, and that makes a big difference when you're going to CPU to GPU platforms. So the data set that I'm going to talk about today mainly is on this. So for the adjoint tomography, we have the 72 events. But in addition to that, some of the events were excluded for validation. So I'm not using the events that go into the model for the inversion. So we're only comparing solutions for these 18 validation earthquakes from WS 256. And we added some additional events to provide more coverage on shore, since a lot of the 18 events were kind of along the coast and offshore. So we obtained 3D solutions for all the events, but only 17 1D solutions. That kind of goes back to my previous comment about we're not able to use a single 1D model to fit particularly these events offshore here. So the black circles are the earthquakes that we're looking at, and the white triangles are all the stations that we end up using for, not for every event, but like the combined. And then in addition to this data set, I'll show a couple of figures where we look at the historical tests, because the historical tests have much limited data since they're older. But we also see kind of similar observation with the improved waveform fits for those data sets. I'm just going to jump straight into the results. So here I'm plotting the full moment tensor solution. So typically for earthquakes, a lot of people just look at the deviatoric. Here we're looking at both components of both Tensor Inversion. On the left-hand side is the 1D Western US model. And on the right-hand side is the 3D Western US model. So one of the first things you notice is they look somewhat similar, except for a couple of events down here have some kind of slightly different mechanism, especially for the full moment tensor. But because these are still rather large events, I think magnitude 5s and 6s, the 1D and 3D solutions are in terms of mechanism, especially double couple component, we don't expect them to change very much. But the key thing is, and the next slide is the deviatoric. So deviatoric solutions look even similar, since you're not allowing that extra degree of freedom to compute the isotropic. But if you look at actually the waveform fits, there is a pretty big difference. So before, so I kind of just want to go and backtrack a little bit. So on the left-hand side, this is a figure from the paper where we do 4 calculations using GCMT. And you can see this is the event, and these are the path to these receivers. And you can see off of the coast. So on the top part here is the spiral model, which we use as our starting model. So this is just based on travel time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like from a couple slides back. You say you use 18 events because you keep 7 you keep 7.
Oh, there's a total of 25 events.
Yeah, I'm a bit confused about what you mean by validation. Do you change those events on an event basis, right?
No, so those were events that had good data, but we didn't use we didn't use it to get the adjoint model. So it's just independent events that were not used to construct the Earth model.
But it doesn't validate the fact that your sourcing it doesn't quantify your source inversion or like gives you input about it, because it's on an event basis. If you take like I'm not quite sure why you use 7 validation events. I'm not sure why they are recorded.
I just didn't want to use the same events that were used to construct the Earth model, because it's a little bit circular, right? Yeah, so I want to use an independent data set that didn't go into making the full waveform. Yeah, did that make sense? Yeah, so this is one of those events, one of the larger ones. And before I talked about the inversion results, if you look at just even comparing to the spiral model, which is a 3D, it's a global model based on travel time and surface wave dispersion, you can see the difference between, so the red lines here are spiral, and at the bottom here, the green lines here are the WS256. You can see we're really starting to fit the later phases of the surface wave. It's a little bit small here, but and then if you look at the bottom, the black and the green are almost on top of each other. So even just using the original GCMT solution, comparing between the two models, there is an improvement there. And if you look at the right-hand side here, this is the 3D inversion of the Western US model. And you can see that for this case, I just wanted to show that, for the rest of the inversion results, we're really fitting at a very high variance reduction, almost like 80 to 90% across a very large distance, because we're looking at anywhere from 200 to 1600 kilometers. Especially if you go further out you can start to see the difference between the 1D and 3D.
How different is it from the CMT?
They are similar, which, I would be worried if they're different. Yeah, because for these size events, they should be similar. I'll show a kind of a comparison of what changed. Yeah. Yeah, so when we started going to smaller, shorter periods right now, we're re-inverting the source, going to shorter periods. So here is a comparison between not GCMT, but like the 1D and the 3D model that I talked about. You can see that they are similar. The difference is, if you look at the waveform fits is a pretty significant difference, 56 to 70%. I think this event probably has like about 60 stations that we selected. And really the improvements are in, you're better aligning the waveforms here. And so some stations definitely improve a lot more than, especially the stations further away. So the mechanism did not change too much, although what we like to see with the 3D model is that for earthquake, it becomes more double couple. That's the assumption that if you kind of capture all the structural heterogeneity and you don't map that into the source. And in this case, we see the double couple went from 43% to 85%, which is a positive result. And this is also looking at full waveform, and it's not introducing spurious isotropic events. So, even though it's a 3D model, it's still a model. So we're always, looking at is it gonna impact for earthquake for the non-double couple part. And here is an example looking at kind of snapshot of the whole region, looking at variance. So the two kind of key parameters that we're looking at in terms of evaluating the improvements in source is the variance reduction. So that's the waveform fits to the data, and also the time shift value that I talked about. So when we're doing the moment tensor inversion, what we typically do is we still go in and shift individual station to align them. And that time shift is kind of everything sort of gets dumped into that value. So either if there's a timing error in the station, or if there's a mislocation, or we think that most of the time it's majority of them, especially for this particular period range, 20 to 50 seconds, it's coming from the structure, from the model. So ideally, when you go from a 1D to 3D, what we like to see is that the goal is to not have to shift at all, right? So because it captures the lateral heterogeneity, or that the time shifts become smaller. And here, if you look at the on the right-hand side here, from the 1D to the 3D case, the time shift dropped, right? So you're on average from 3 to 1 second. And in this case, more stations we didn't have to shift at all to fit the data. And in terms of waveform fits, overall, just across the board, just increased throughout the entire distant range. So this is just one event. What I'd like to see is actually looking at the data set as a whole. So here's the box plots for the variance reduction time shift for all the paths bin by distance. What the 3D model does is enable us to have really good fits at with low spread at all the distance, especially the far distance. And why this is important is because not everywhere has the coverage of the Western US. Especially if you look at other parts of the world, we're probably not going to have a bunch of stations at to less than maybe even less than 1,000 kilometers. And a lot of times when you kind of go beyond that distance with the 1D model, we start to have to test different 1D models, averaging them, do a lot of tricks to fit the data. But the 3D model allows us, because so one of the arguments you will say, well, this is long period. What is the advantage of using the 3D model? Because it does take resources to compute them. So if you're in a region where you don't have close-in stations, which is in many cases that the areas we're interested in monitoring, then this 3D model will take care of that path differences. And you can use one model. And here we've shown that the waveform fits across. Here I'm looking at the deviatoric and the full multi solution. The waveform fits stayed relatively stable throughout the whole distance, up to I think we kind of cut it off at 1,600 kilometers. But we done fits beyond that and still looks excellent. Whereas compared to the 1D case, you can see it start to fall, and there start to be a very significant scatter. And one thing you could do is start to do different 1D models, but then things start to get kind of complicated there.
Excuse me, Andrea, but the 3D model, the WUS 256, has a 1D average, which is different from WUS probably.
Yes, it is. Yes.
So you haven't convinced me that it's not the 1D model, just average that causes this distance shift. It could be just because most of the nonlinearity in the propagation problem is in the 1D model. I mean, I'm sure you're right, but this doesn't convince.
Okay.
See what I mean?
Yeah,
I'd like to see a comparison of the WUS model with the average of the WUS 256.
Yeah, I think we have a figure in the paper, right?
Yeah, well, a challenge there is, if you just compute the average of a 3D model, then it has no model.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, then it just has this broad, it
Yeah.
goes from, 8 kilometers in the Pacific to 45 kilometers in Colorado. So it's not that meaningful. So, I mean, I suppose you could come up with what is the mean crustal thickness of the region.
Yeah.
But, the important point is that a 1D model is never going to scatter any energy. It's never going to put any, energy from love wave into Rayleigh wave, for example. And we see that. Yeah, but that's what helps the variance reduction.
Yeah. So if you look at let's see if I can go back to the figure.
That's a helpful discussion.
Thanks, already. So this might not be the best example, but for example, here, I don't have the 1D case, but basically these later phases, we just couldn't fit them with 1D.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. And that really impacts the variance reduction, and that all gets mapped into the source. So I think the problem was because one of the things is that we want to know what the uncertainty are for the sources, not just like one point or like one beach ball. When you're doing monitoring, then that uncertainty starts to matter a lot. Yeah. So the goal really is try to kind of narrow down that uncertainty. So it's the similar case with the time shift. So this is just looking at the ensemble of all the different events that we looked at. And you can see that the time shifts remain, relatively the same across all the distance, whereas for a 1D case, a lot of times the accumulated travel time errors will they get larger and larger at the farther away distance. But I mean, in this case, it's kind of a little bit interesting. There's a huge spread here, but kind of the average seems to start to get a little bit slightly lower. It's kind of an interesting observation there. And one of the other things that we want to look at, I'm not sure how many people have seen these moon plots, but it's nice to look at the beach balls, but what we're really trying to get at is looking at how are the earthquakes and the explosions more separated? Are they closer? Is the uncertainty larger or smaller? So looking at this full moment tensor in the eigensphere is another way kind of sort of discriminating between events. And another sort of key feature of using this type of representation and not the beach ball is that you don't have to assume a decomposition scheme because you're just plotting basically the three eigenvalues in 3D space. So basically the source type plot that I'll show later is just a slice of this wedge. So all the moment tensors can plot on this particular wedge. So here's just an example from a paper in 2018 where you have all of the explosions kind of plot at the top and the earthquakes plot at the bottom, or in the middle here in the equator area. And then all the mine collapses plot at the bottom. So the positive isotropic and negative isotropic. So they naturally separate. So what we would like to look at is how does this pattern change from 1D to 3D. So we use, so there's a couple of ways to plot these. We used what we call the tape and tape parameterization. So it's on the sphere. You've probably seen some other figures where they plot it on the cube. The advantage of using this particular one, like I said before, decomposition is not necessary. And then you can start to use them to characterize source uncertainty, inversion stability as a function of a variety of things, noise, station configuration, in this case, Earth model. So one of the things is to compare this 1D and 3D moment tensors. So on the right-hand side, I'll start with the loom plot first. So the blue is the 3D moment tensors, and then the red is the 1D. And here I've included, so here's a case where the 1D, this is one of the offshore events where it has a very large spurious isotropic that got dumped into. So even though the mechanism was not quite correct either. Whereas the 3D, all the 3D solutions plot near the earthquake. And you have a couple of events that kind of jump out a little bit, but overall, they're a little bit more closer to the earthquake population. It's a rather smaller sample size, so there's still quite a bit of a scatter. But with the 3D model, you kind of get rid of these events that are kind of really outliers. And here is like kind of another way of looking at it for more quantitatively. So this is looking at angular differences between the matrices. So on the top here, on the bottom here, the omega angle accounts for differences in orientation and eigenvalues. So not just the distance along this loom, but also the mechanism, the double couple mechanism, how much they rotate. So basically the larger the angle, the more different the two solutions are between 1D and 3D. They're, most of them are, I would still call them relatively similar, but of course you have these like outlier events, which is this one. And it's kind of an outlier one, and you can see that the 1D solution fits poorly. And the omega DC, which is the top part here, is just looking at angular difference between the two closest double couples. So it's just focusing on the double couple component since these events are mostly just earthquake. So this is kind of a neat way to kind of look at how similar your solutions are and are not.
What's special about this outlier?
Yeah, so this is one of the offshore events. So, I've looked at using different 1D models to improve them, and you can make small improvements with different, stations recorded at different, along the coast. I think this one is off of Oregon. So you can definitely improve it with a different velocity model. But I think the couple models that I tried still has a relatively lower fit. Yeah. Whereas the 3D model actually produced really good results. And I think that was kind of one of the biggest takeaway from this particular is that it really helped a lot of the offshore events. compared to what our existing 1D models are.
For this ocean event, do you have the mesh for the ocean when you build the model?
Yeah, so the entire domain that I showed before, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so even though we still have relatively limited resolution offshore, because you can see all the earthquakes are kind of centered onshore, right? There's only a few offshore events. But because we happen to have in the inversion of the model, we have some events there that provides some decent coverage. So at least that particular path that we're sampling in the source inversion is kind of sampled by the data set for the model. Yeah. And I think at this frequency band, it was we were able to use those paths. And here is kind of going back to what's changed between the 1D and 3D. And kind of as we were working on this project, another paper came out this year where GCMT they did a comparison of 1D and their 3D moment tensors. So on the left hand side, I'm plotting one of their figures from the paper. You can see the first thing that they observed is they saw kind of the overall shallowing of the vents by 4 kilometers, which is this is the bottom part here. So kind of depth change went to the negative direction. And then they also see a slightly higher, more DC component. So this is the from the purple color to kind of the green. So basically, if it's more closer to the center, so they're using this epsilon parameter. Basically, if it's 0, then it's double couple, and if the further out you go, the more CLVD it becomes. So you can see the overall shift in the population from 1D to 3D. And although we're a much smaller sample size compared to GCMT, but we also kind of see that the shallowing of the vents if you look at the depth changes. So as I was doing inversion, I noticed that our events also kind of shifted to the shallower part of the crust. And then we also see kind of just a slight increase in DC components. It's more kind of obvious in the deviatoric. So you can see the red are the 1D solutions, and then the blue are the 3D solutions. So even though it's a much smaller sample size, we seem to be, kind of fitting sort of the other trends that people are seeing in GCMT. And they're also using, I think they're using the GLAD model. I think I have it in mind. Yeah, 2050. So this is, different inversion, different model, but starting to see some similar observations. And yeah.
Do you have any idea of the influence of topography on those results?
So with this frequency band, so we're doing 20 to 50 seconds at pretty large distance, so it's not as much. I think we did some. So I've done like 3D moment tensors in much local region at the test site, or the former test site, where we looked at some pretty small chemical shots that are magnitude 2s and going up to 12 hertz. Then we have to put in topography and all that. Yeah. And I know in DPRK, people have argued that because the North Korea, the test site, because it's on a steep mountain, topography start to play into effect when you go to shorter periods. But at 20 to 50 seconds, okay. I mean, we did put in topography in the 3D. I guess I forgot to mention that. And so this is the data set for the validation. And I kind of just want to show some examples because these are, larger events with a lot of data. So I kind of just want to show some of the other types of data that we looked at. So this is one of the nuclear tests at Junction I think this is one of the later ones in 92. So we can see that the coverage is much more limited now. Thankfully, there's we have broadband waveforms from Southern California, and there's also the local Livermore. Actually, we didn't include the Livermore network here because their instant response cuts up at 30 seconds. So we couldn't use those data for 20 to 50 second inversion. And you kind of see a similar result here. It's not as sort of striking as the other one because we are in kind of a closer distance. So this is stations up to I think 1,000 kilometer here. I mean, you see kind of slight improvement away from fits. The isotropic component is a little bit lower in this case, which is a little interesting. Yeah, and so the overall with these particular explosions that we looked at, I think we looked at 10 or 15 of them. We all of them see kind of an increase in the isotropic moment because you're starting to fit the amplitudes better, especially some of the later.
Maybe this is a particular case, but the MW is very different.
Yeah.
Or
So
the-
for all the explosions, the MW seems to be a little bit larger with the
For the
3D
3D.
model. Yeah, I mean, because you have different densities and whatnot.
But that might be the implication is huge, isn't it? Because this is the explosion, so if you want to.
Yeah, if you want to use
yield,
moment for yield,
Right, it's gonna
so
be.
that kind of gets into another can of worms.
I was wondering, it's much more bigger source compared to what we think the 1D model.
Yeah, a lot of them comes, this particular example,
Maybe these are only particular.
yeah,
this
I think
one.
I didn't plot all of the stations, but some of the stations that it's just that the amplitudes are larger now, yeah. Well, the synthetic, I mean. Yeah, but that's kind of it's kind of a question, is there really that much larger? But, all of the events seems to go a little bit higher, some of them not as high as this one, I think this is one of the highest, the biggest difference.
1D to 3D.
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, there's a pretty big jump there, and yeah, when people see that, they're like, well, what does that mean? If you want to use moment tensor magnitudes for estimating the size of the explosion, then it kind of definitely raises some questions. And there's also a depth dependence. If you go to shallower, they tend to get larger too. Yeah, so in the collapse, there's also, this is a smaller difference between the two compared to the other one. And in this case, one thing, let me see here. Yeah, you can see this is a smaller event, so this is a 4.8, a jump to the 5.18. So there is definitely an increase in moment, which I'm not quite sure, what is probably have to look at more events to see, population as a whole, is it really always so significant? There's definitely a couple of events where they are similar. Yeah, in this case, it's also just similarly, the waveform fits are a little bit better. But, obviously the coverage is a little bit more, skewed to the side. And isotropic part is a little bit smaller. And here is just the little smaller main shock. So this earthquake happened, relatively close to the test site. So this is kind of an event that people are always interested in looking at. And the biggest kind of takeaway here is really we're starting to fit some of the stations at 900 kilometers better. You can see the time shifts here improved. And here is, one station that knows that polarity flipped. So for the historic test and the seismicity as a whole, if you look at the 1D and 3D, so here, similar color scheme. The 1D is the red dots and red symbols, and then the blue is the 3D. So one of the issues that we saw with some of the explosion data was that it was getting, the 1D solutions were looking less isotropic. So this is one event that really stood out. With the 3D model, they all kind of cluster around the crack. So on the loon here, the stars are the explosion. And then the red dots here are, in the circles are the collapse. The earthquakes and the diamonds are the collapse. So the collapse, we only have 2 because the other events were too small for 20 to 50 second inversion. And kind of this asymmetric, so theoretically, people have argued explosion is, spherical across the entire, compressional out. But in reality, they are usually, there's some asymmetry, and they typically cluster around the opening crack. And then there's a couple explanations for this, but one of them is that, these very shallowly buried explosions don't usually generate spherical symmetric elastic effects. That's why you don't have the spherical, that's why the events don't cluster around the pure isotropic component here. And this kind of goes back to the uncertainty part that I was talking about before. Really, when we're looking at these events, we don't want to look at a point. We want to look at all the good solutions. In this case, between the 1D and the 3D, the spread is similar, but with the 3D, it kind of shifted more towards center around the double couple for this earthquake. So all of these contours here are basically the solutions that are at or above a certain threshold of the maximum value. So the overall fit increase, but also kind of a shift to a more double couple for the earthquake. So this is kind of a way to approximate the confidence region of the solution for a moment tensor for any kind of given inversion. And if you look at the explosion and the collapse, you see a big difference between 1D and 3D here. And the region of the best fitting solution gets smaller between from the 1D to 3D. And for the Trona mining events, they're a little bit similar. And this is the reason because the events are already fitting. Overall fit is already lower. So typically when we draw these contours become quite narrow here. But I will say that, fitting at 50% and above, there is kind of there's a general trend. Not all of them looks like this because of, you're also factoring into where your station's at and how is sampling the radiation patterns. But there is some general trend that the uncertainty region is a little bit smaller. This is still kind of work in progress on this part, especially. Try to interpret these. What is my time? Okay, I'm getting at the conclusions now. So kind of the takeaway is that this project really illustrates some of the value of using adjoint waveform tomography for reliable 3D Earth models. And kind of I want us to focus on especially those distance stations that we typically, probably won't be able to utilize, particularly those offshore events. The reason that we are able to use it here is because it's well studied and we have good 1D models for all these regions. But when you go to somewhere else where you don't have either a lot of seismicity or just don't have access to the close-in data, and do you just not monitor those regions, you still have to somehow rely on some kind of model. And if there is a good or a kind of a trustworthy 3D model to start with, even at these period ranges, I think there's definitely some value, especially if you're only limited to distance data. So one of the observations from the 3D inversions is that we definitely do see kind of an increasing seismic moment. So kind of puzzling over as to what exactly the reason, because you have different models, different density, that kind of factors into how the moment changes. But another key is that there's less time shift required to fit the data. And honestly, when I'm looking at some of these events, I probably don't have to shift the data because I'm just trying to get the best optimal solution, so I shift them. But for the 3D model, if you don't have to shift the data, that saves a lot of time for monitoring, and also kind of gives you more confidence that the model is really capturing the wave propagation effect, where we don't have to make these adjustments that are sometimes can be a little bit arbitrary. Like you're trying to justify to people why we shift a second here to second here. And so that's for the validation data set. Historic explosion collapses show kind of similar results. And then the goal right now is really to continue these inversion and test the efficacy of the model with different networks and sources. So there is a new iteration of the model 309 that goes down to 16 seconds, uses a larger data set. And really the target here is really to go down to 10 seconds so we can look at some of the smaller, like low magnitude 4s and high magnitude 3 events where there's not a lot of good signal at 20 to 50 seconds. And I will just stop here. Take any questions. Sorry, went a little bit.
Questions from anybody?
I have if you don't have, so in an area that doesn't have station coverage,
you might still have lots of earthquakes. Can you then calculate the 3D model if you don't have nearby stations? Like, I don't quite understand the process.
Yeah, if you have stations outside and you have a lot, if you're recording interior, so as long as you can have a lot of crossing paths, I think that's kind of always the question. If you have the crossing paths, and yeah.
Okay, so it's more about
Yeah, trying to make sure that your rays are crossing.
and is there like a maximum, like, can you do it at 2,000 kilometers, or does it be within 1,000 kilometers?
No, it doesn't. Yeah, I mean, as long as you're, for GCMT, they do teleseismic, they go up to yeah. As long as your wave propagation solver can. If you're doing like the usual Herman codes or something, those are flatter. So if you go beyond that distance, calculate the spherical. The limit is really the model.
Well,
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that to get the 3D tensor solutions, it requires substantially more work and computational power than just the 1D inversions.
I wouldn't say so. It's not. It's the inversion part itself is the same, basically. The difference is how you construct the Green's functions is different. So actually, most of the work is trying to get a model.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And the reason that in this case we had a issue with the large data set just because we were in the Western US, so we have a lot of data. In the past, when I've done moment tensor inversion, I never had the luxury of that many data. So that's how we had to do the HDF file because we just have too many waveforms to process.
All right.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I was thinking, you think sometime in the future we might have catalogs of these 3D movies, or even process.
Yeah, so the actual inversion routine itself is basically the same, right? So the brunt of the work is to compute those Green's functions ahead of time. And those can be done offline. So you can just pre-compute them, and when you're actually running the inversion, you're just trying to read the right Green's function. Yeah. So the actual inversion itself is not the part that takes time. So when I'm running these, I'm waiting for the 3D Green's functions to be calculated. Not that I'm taking longer to invert for them.
other last questions?
Yeah, can I just ask a clarification? No, just a clarification on this point. So you imagine at some point in the future, there might be like a library or an atlas of these Green's functions that might be available to the community, and then therefore for the members of the broader community, it would actually be a fairly straightforward use of these models without that much in the way of computation.
Yeah, just having the models itself might not be enough.
No, that's what I'm wondering.
Computed.
Yeah,
So you have to have the model and the resource to compute the 3D Green's function. So if you have the model, what I was thinking is you can do reciprocity and just store, for example, you have a particular area and you have a fixed number of network. Of course, if you add more stations, then you have to compute them. But then you can store those Green's functions for a particular region, and you have to assume like a region that you think will have events and calculate horizontal, on the grid basically, and you can store them and just retrieve them like you would do like the 1D case. But you still need all the resources beforehand to compute them. Yeah.
well, what I'm wondering, if you have the resource, someone has the resource.
Yeah.
Can't they be in principle pre-computed and updated?
Yeah.
So in that sense, it becomes a low community resource, in principle, in theory.
Yeah.
It already exists for the global, like the instance size database.
Yeah, like insta size basically. Yeah. So you could just do something like that. And institutions that have the resources and who make the model can basically compute them and just store them. Yeah. So if it's already computed, then the inversion part is straightforward.
Yes,
Quick one.
last question.
Conceivably, you can also combine 1D and 3D models, right? With 3D, covering the area with more details, and 1D for maybe more distant areas. Can you not do that?
You can certainly do that, yeah.
lower resolution.
Yeah,
Okay, we'll lower the resolution,
yeah, like if you have,
but you will have a bigger coverage then.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be 1D, we have pretty good.
yeah, it can be global.
I know you.
Actually, for North Korea, we use a global 3D to compute, stations to Japan, because that's better than the 1D. So even that we can start to see, even though they're not adjoint. I think the ones that were tested a couple years ago, they were not adjoint tomography. But even that, you can start to see that it's capturing the surface wave for even 20-50 seconds, the 1D model is not doing great.
So I'm not able to see whether we have questions online, but let's thank Andrea again. And I assume we still have the reception on the second floor balcony.
Yeah, so, right? Does anybody know?